Now we're gonna attempt to service or replace the bearing on this alternator rotor shaft. The bearing is making noise during operation. Had it before. Now we have the solvent soaked into all the grease and dirt that has built up inside the ball bearing. We're going to check the seal in the back to see if it's leaking. Now I fill the ball bearing up with cleaning solvent to check see if the other side of the seal has a leak. We will know this if the fluid disappears from inside the ball bearing. Now we could wash the ball bearing by having the solvent in there. From the look of the bearing, the seal is probably still good because the solvent remains inside the bearing. So we're going to keep washing it like this with our hand. Then we're going to take it to have some compressed air, blow out the ball bearing and inside the race. Then we're going to place this in the sun and let it dry, some natural heat. Okay, so now I have the bearing drying in the sun, and this is the noise I want you to listen for. That's the noise we were getting when we removed the alternator from the engine. The reason we're getting that noise now when we didn't get it before is because of the temperature. Since the alternator was on the engine, when we removed it, the temperature caused the bearing to give that kind of noise because the bearing is dry inside. Now that we have cleaned up the bearing, we're going to apply grease into the bearing, and by doing so, the bearing will be lubed with the grease, and the temperature will no longer be an effect to the ball bearing because the lubrication from the grease will be able to control the temperature, keeping it to a medium. So we have no side play, or should I say any clearance that's noticeable from moving the outer race of the bearing. So we're going to let it dry, and then we're going to repack it with grease. I've done this many times before. Probably going to get another 30,000 miles out of the bearing. It will be enough time to buy a new bearing. Now we're going to put a drop of oil in there. We're going to put some grease. Make sure the seal in the back of the bearing, that's the seal back here, does not come apart. Also, we're going to mix the new grease with the old grease, and this is going to give us something fair to work with. We're not going to have perfect grease in the bearing because the other side of the bearing already have some dry grease from before, which we didn't remove. Maybe we washed it out, but who knows. So we're going to put a lot of grease on this side in an attempt that it will move to the other side and mix with the old grease and everything will be just perfect. Now the reason why I put a lot of grease is because when we replace this seal is going to push the excess grease to the other side of the ball bearing race, you know, giving both sides of the bearing lubrication, because we really can't get to the bottom side of the bearing. Plus, this bearing is only to be used once. It's not a bearing that you could remove and install again. To remove this bearing, we will have to pull from here, the outer race, and by pulling on the outer race, we will cause distortion between the bar, which is known as the cage, the ball, and the inner race. This bearing is installed by pressing on the inner race, which does not affect the ball, the cage, and the outer race, but removing it will have an effect on the ball bearing and the inner race. So that's why we did not remove it. We try to service it. If it fails, then we're going to remove it, and by doing so it's going to get destroyed. But replacing the new one, it's easy. It's just pressing it on. Now all this excess grease, when I push this seal in, it's going to push some of the grease to the other side of the bearing, helping us lube the bearing totally. That's it. Now we have restored the performance of our bearing. You could also take a piece of rubber, a drill, put the rubber on the end, this will help you mix the grease up real good inside the bearing, so when you put it back on the vehicle, the heat will already be under control. So that's it. We have serviced a seal ball bearing. Most seal ball bearing are serviceable. Don't listen to what the manufacturers say. They just want you to keep buying. So you have seen it yourself. Now we have a smooth running bearing. I forgot to show you how to remove the seal on the bearing. So I'm going to show you how to remove it now. You're going to take a razor blade. As you can see, this is a rusty one. Don't use a sharp one because you might cut the seal and damage it. If you have a brand new one, just make the edge, the sharp edge, just make it dull. Scrape it on the concrete or something. So you're going to take the razor blade and you're going to insert it right here, and you're going to pop the seal up. That's how you get the seal out. Be careful not to damage it. And to put it back, you would just simply press it in by hand. The seal has lips, and the race of the bearing also have some grooves that the seal will sit into, and it will not come out. I wish I could have showed it to you before and show you all the dry grease inside the bearing. Now we're going to attempt to remove the seal ball bearing from the front case of the alternator. The bearing is in here. It's held in place by this plate with 3 screws. It would be good to put some oil always You don't want to strip the head of these screws. Now and there we have another seal bearing. I'm not gonna remove it. I'm not gonna try to use a hammer or anything to get it out. We're just gonna try to service it right in there. Because remember, we don't want to distort the bearing because it's already dry and it has poor lubricant inside. As we can see, this bearing looks pretty good. The grease is pretty much saturated in there. We're going to clean it up and put some more grease into it. Okay, now we're going to fill the bearing up with some cleaning solvent to check the seal on the other side, to make sure that it does not leak. Also going to spin the race on the bearing. By doing so, you can see little solids of grease will come up on the top of the bearing. You're removing all the dry grease inside the bearing by doing this. Just be gentle. Make sure you get a pick like this, is very helpful. And you use the air, you blow it out. Get all the stuff. I'll scrape it up, break it up a little. This is all the old grease. The temperature have burnt it. Now you can see the race of the bearing has its natural color, which is like a brown instead of the black. Now we're going to let it dry again in the sun. Then we're going to repack it with grease and assemble it. And we have saved 2 bearings by servicing them. Now that the bearing is dry, we're going to take some more grease and just press it in to the bearing with your finger. This will fill all the cavity inside the bearing with new grease. This is restoring the performance of the bearing. And you will clean up the seal. Get all the old grease out of it. You don't want the old grease. You don't want too much of the old grease to mix with the new grease. It's kind of like a bad habit and a good habit, you know. so you want to get rid of as much of the bad grease as you can. I'm going to wash it out real good. By the way, this seal is a steel rib seal, which means it has a steel backing on it, so it's not that easy to damage with a razor blade. Just fill the seal with grease, because it does have a cavity to take some. And then we're going to press it right back in. And place some grease on the treads of the screws. Try to catch all the screws up first before you torque them down. And that's it. Thank you for watching.